Hi there, I'm Timothy Linsdau, video producer and Christian. Today I'm putting on my science cap again on the anniversary of the Apollo 11 and the tremendous vehicle that had to be built to make that event successful, and that would be the Saturn V launch vehicle. If you would, before we start, like and comment on my video and subscribe to my channel to support it if you would. Thank you. You know, the manned missions to the moon would not have happened without this tremendous vehicle. First of all, let's talk a little bit where they came up with the 5. And that comes from the F1 engines that were built to power the rocket. There were 5 of them. And the Saturn V still remains the largest and most powerful U.S. expendable launch vehicle ever built. And that's established. Those 5 engines, by the way, one of those, the dimensions is the actual base of the engine, base end, is over 12 feet in diameter, and there were 5 of these, which is incredible. The whole rocket included the command module, which is the the spacecraft part of it, the service module, everything to support it, and the lunar module, which is the thing, of course, that landed on the moon. Now they all sat on top of the launch vehicle, and also above the command module is an emergency escape system. If you look close at the rocket, you'll see another little rocket sitting right on top, and that was designed in case of an emergency to lift the capsule off and carry it to safety. That would be their last-ditch effort for rescue. There were other rescue systems, but that's not what we're talking about today. The complete assembly of this rocket system went to the moon was 363 feet tall, over 36 stories. The size of this thing to have enough fuel to get into orbitable speed and lunar speed to break free from the Earth. The whole thing weighed over 6 million pounds. Wow. Again, it was in 3 stages. All right, not necessarily again, but in 3 stages. The first stage includes the 5 F1 engines producing 7.7 million pounds of thrust. Now, these powerful engines are required to lift the heavy rocket fast enough to escape Earth's gravity. And the first stage engines are burned at liftoff and last for about 2.5 minutes. That takes the vehicle payload to an altitude of 38 miles. The first stage then separates and burns up in the atmosphere. And that's something different from what they're working on now, is with rockets that are actually reusable. That was the whole idea of the shuttle, was to try to create a reusable vehicle, and that's what they're working on these rockets. The first stage then separates, burns up. The second stage contains what's called the J5 J2 engines. Now, after the first stage is discarded, the second stage burns for approximately 6 minutes, taking the vehicle and payload to 115 miles altitude. The second stage is then also discarded, and it burns up too. The third stage contains 1 J2 engine, and this engine burns for 2.75 minutes, boosting the spacecraft to orbital velocity of about 17,500 miles an hour. And that puts it into perpetual orbital ability to orbit the planet without being drawn back in to the atmosphere. Now, the third stage is shut down with fuel remaining when they get up to orbit speed, and it remains attached to the spacecraft in Earth orbit. The J2 engine is reignited to propel the spacecraft into translunar trajectory at a speed of around 24,500 miles an hour before finally being discarded. And that's what, at that moment, the moment they used that, pushed man out beyond the reaches of the Earth into space for the first time in Apollo 8. And that's a big deal. That's the first time that happened. So we got that great big first stage with hundreds of thousands of pounds of fuel to make that first heavy lift off the Earth. Because you have that, at that point you have maximum gravity and maximum air pressure. And the higher it gets, the less gravity and the less pressure. So they have to get that big chunk of weight off the ground and moving. And then move on to the next stage, the second stage, and then the third stage. Now, once they get through the third stage, once they're launched towards the moon, you know, at that point they have to make their docking with the lunar lander and all that kind of stuff to make everything work later on. But anyway, there's the basics of the size of that monster rocket. The biggest vehicle ever built is their claim to fame with the Saturn V. And that's what von Braun, the lead scientist, led them to. It's creating this multi-stage rocket that could do the job to get him there. Some of the details, again, those big engines were over 12 feet across. It had 203,000 gallons of fuel, and that's kerosene they used. And then they had over around 318,000 gallons of liquid oxygen. And you put those two together, it gave him the heat and combustion you needed to drive that giant weight to propel it into orbit. And then the second stage also had 5 smaller rocket engines, and it used about 80,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and about 260,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen fuel, all to make this thing work. The numbers are amazing. Like, just incredible. Now, the third stage, it had about 67,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen fuel. And also it had about 20,000 gallons of liquid oxygen needed for burning fuel in space. Is remember that space is a vacuum. So, you know, they're not going to... might be a problem for burning. Now, on top of that third stage came the lunar module, and it's designed to carry 2 astronauts to the lunar surface. On top of that was the Apollo spacecraft, and that's the capsule and everything that supports it. Now, what they had to do was get that lunar module out and away, and then take the capsule and flip the lunar module around and connect with it so they could move into it. That ability to make those maneuvers in space was all practiced before this moment, before they actually had to do it, and it worked. That's an amazing part about Apollo 11. Not the engineers and those experienced with this space race didn't have their doubts that they could complete the task. They just had their doubts that this Apollo 11 would work the very first time, perfect the whole way, which it did. And it was of some surprise to them. Thank goodness, of course, there were no deaths involved in that actual expedition. Even though 3 Apollo astronauts died in the Apollo 1 in the test vehicle, Chaffee, Grissom, and White perished in that fire, which was a terrible thing. So there you go. That's construction of the biggest vehicle ever made, the Saturn V rocket. The next generation will be quite powerful, but it'll be a combination of 3 rockets, but that's something else to talk about later on. But remember, from the time that this was announced by JFK in 1961, to put that whole system together to create the largest vehicle that we've ever made, and to get people successfully on and off the moon and do that in 8 years is really astounding. It does show what we can do if we get our minds behind it and we come together. That's our greatest struggle, is it not, coming together on something to complete a good, noble task. There's your challenge for the day. Like and comment on this video, subscribe to the channel to support it. And just like this great vehicle, get out there and make it a great day.